Hello and welcome to our special coverage of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I am Ladi Akiridolu. The headlines. Ukraine dismisses more than a dozen officers in fight against corruption. Two British voluntary aid workers are confirmed dead during Ukraine evacuation. Plus, Belarus leader Alexander Lukashenko says he has been asked to seal a non-aggression pact with Ukraine. We begin out of the Ukrainian capital, Kiev, where the country's president, Volodymyr Zelensky, has dismissed more than a dozen senior officials, including governors of various major provinces and battlefields as well, in the biggest shakeup of its wartime leadership since Russia's invasion in February last year. Ukrainian Prime Minister Denis Shmyhal pledged more anti-corruption efforts during a cabinet session amidst mass resignations across the government. While addressing Ukrainian ministers, Mr. Shmyhal stressed the necessity of working on a new system key for Ukraine's European direction. A deputy defense minister, a deputy prosecutor, deputy head of President Volodymyr Zelensky's office, and two deputy ministers responsible for regional development were among those who left. Some, though not all, had been linked with corruption allegations. Meanwhile, Democratic and Republican U.S. lawmakers have praised the Ukrainian government for taking swift action against corruption and insisted that U.S. military and humanitarian aid to President Zelensky's government would continue. Republican Senator Lindsey Graham says, quote, "It's a defining moment for Ukraine. It's a defining moment for all of us, Germany, the United States, all of our allies. We expect that President Zelensky will follow through with the promise he made that Ukraine is going to change on the corruption front." And British voluntary aid workers Chris Parry and Andrew Bagshaw have been killed during an attempted humanitarian evacuation in eastern Ukraine. That's according to Mr. Parry's family, weeks after they were reported missing in the war-torn country. In a statement released by Britain's Foreign Office, the family said, quote, "It is with great sadness that we have to announce that our beloved Chrissy has been killed, along with his colleague Andrew Bagshaw, while attempting a humanitarian evacuation from Soledar in eastern Ukraine." Russia's Wagner Group had said earlier this month that its forces had found the body of one of the workers who had been reported missing in eastern Ukraine, the scene of heavy fighting between Ukrainian and Russian forces. Ukrainian police have said the two left the city of Kramatorsk for Soledar on January the 6th and were reported missing the next evening after contact was lost with them.
Крістофер погодиться на евакуацію. У цій частині Бахмуту Крістофер Перрі зник зі зв'язку у Солидарі.
And this is Andrew, my New Zealander companion. You want to say a couple of words? We are live.
And White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre says the United States will continue to communicate to China the implications of providing material support to Russia's war against Ukraine. Ms. Jean-Pierre did not specify the type of implications the Chinese government might face, but said they had been monitoring the situation.
The implications. We're closely monitoring the situation as we have been since the war started. We will continue to communicate to China the implications of providing material support to Russia's war against Ukraine. We have talked about this many times, that we will be very clear what it means to support Russia's aggression against Ukraine. And as I've said many times, as my colleagues from NSC has said many times, we will continue to support Ukraine and the Ukrainian people as long as needed.
Meanwhile, two U.S. officials have said the United States, in a reversal, is poised to start a process that would eventually send dozens of M1 Abrams battle tanks to Ukraine. The officials, who would prefer to remain anonymous, said an announcement could come as early as today. A third source familiar with the matter said the U.S. commitment could be a total of about 30 Abrams tanks to be delivered over the coming months. The two officials said the tanks would likely be procured through a fund known as the Ukraine Assistance Initiative for Security, which allows President Joe Biden's administration to get weapons from industry rather than from existing U.S. weapon stocks. And staying with weapons supply, the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz has decided to send Leopard 2 battle tanks to Ukraine and allow other countries such as Poland to do so. Kiev has had pleaded for months for Western tanks that it says it desperately needs to give its forces the firepower and mobility to break through Russian defense lines and recapture occupied territory in the east and south. Earlier, Poland said it had formally sent a request to the German government to allow it send some of its Leopard tanks to Ukraine, pushing Berlin closer to a long-awaited decision on allowing the re-export of the NATO Warhorse heavy tank. However, Mr. Scholz had been wary of moves that could spur Russia to escalate the war and what he sees as a risk of the NATO alliance being drawn into the conflict. And Russian President Vladimir Putin has said that Russia's anti-aircraft defenses were amongst the world's best during a televised meeting with the governor of a province on the Ukrainian border that is regularly shelled by Kiev's forces. The governor of the Belgorod region, Vyacheslav Gladkov, told Mr. Putin during the meeting that 25 local civilians had been killed and 96 injured in shelling since the beginning of the war in Ukraine.
The combat has shown that Russia's air defense system is one of the best in the world. I've already said it. What the U.S. produces in terms of the missiles for Patriot systems, our country produces 3 times as many of such missiles, even more than 3 times as much. As for air defense missiles in general, for different purposes, Russian production is comparable with all-round world production. Among other things, the systems themselves are modern and reliable. Anything can happen, but overall, the system is working and is in order.
Mr. Putin also says there were shortages of some medicines in Russia and that prices had gone up despite the country producing more of its own drugs. While prescription drugs are exempt from Western sanctions imposed on Russia after it sent tens of thousands of troops into Ukraine in February last year, their delivery to Russia has been hit by transport, insurance and customs hurdles caused by the conflict and other restrictive measures.
The thing is that prices have risen somewhat lately. There has been a shortage of some drugs, despite the fact that we saw production of pharmaceutical products in the first 3 quarters of last year grow by about 22%. While the share of Russian medicine is 60% on the market, nonetheless, we had a deficit in some medicines and prices have risen.
And former Russian President Dmitry Medvedev has hit back at Western reports that Russia is running low on missiles and artillery, saying Moscow's weapons stocks were enough to continue fighting in Ukraine. Ukrainian and Western military officials had said Russia is facing a shortage of arms after firing thousands of artillery shells and missiles at Ukraine more than 11 months after the crisis began. Mr. Medvedev told officials during a visit that drones were in especially high demand for what Moscow calls its special military operation. But Russia and Ukraine have used drones in multiple attacks since the start of the war, as they're relatively cheap, precise, and are seen as safer than manned aircraft. Meanwhile, the International Atomic Energy Agency chief, Rafael Grossi, told the European Parliament that an inspection of Ukrainian nuclear plants found no military equipment, debunking a claim from Russia. Mr. Grossi's remarks came the day after Russia's Foreign Intelligence Service accused Ukraine of storing Western-supplied arms at nuclear power stations across the country, an allegation dismissed as untrue by a senior Ukrainian official.
In-store or...
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for joining us.
You may remember the
30 minutes time for an exchange of views
of the Ukrainian employees in Zaporizhia. There have been numerous reports. Hello. The situation throughout Ukraine, of course, in military terms, it's what it is, and you know it. It is not getting any better. And if anything, there is quite clear indication of a possibility of an increase in wounds of bombing, and our inspectors are hearing it in the vicinity of it. So the situation is pretty tense, as you can, of course, imagine.
I will accompany you outside. And colleagues of AFET, we will continue our meeting in roughly 5 to 10 minutes.
Finland's President Sauli Niinisto says his country's membership in NATO will likely have to wait till after the elections in Turkey. Sweden and Finland applied last year to join the North Atlantic Treaty Organization after Russia invaded Ukraine and need the backing of all current NATO states to advance their application.
That Belarus doesn't lose its... We have never intended and do not intend to attack Belarus. And this is the main message from the Ukrainian nation to the Belarus nation. It is very important to us that Belarus doesn't lose its sovereignty and that it doesn't enter, irrespective of whatever influence is exerted, that it doesn't enter this absolutely shameful war. I'm sure they do not want to attack or enter with force. That's why we would be very surprised if the attack comes from this direction by the Belarusian forces.
That actually was Vladimir Zelensky speaking with Sauli Niinisto during a meeting that took place in Kiev. Meanwhile, as Mr. Zelensky was speaking, the Belarusian leader Alexander Lukashenko has said that he had been asked to conclude a non-aggression pact with Ukraine, and that's according to the Belta State News Agency, citing comments that suggested he saw Kiev as a potential threat. Mr. Lukashenko, a close ally of Russian President Vladimir Putin, disclosed the alleged offer to a meeting of government and law enforcement officials, at which he also accused Ukraine, without evidence, of allowing its territory to be used by the West to train and arm militants who could destabilize the situation in Belarus. Mr. Lukashenko was quoted as saying, "They are asking us not to go to war with Ukraine in any circumstances, not to move our troops there. They are proposing we conclude a non-aggression pact." However, it was not immediately clear from his comments whether Ukraine itself or the West had made the alleged offer. Welcome back. Czech Foreign Minister Jan Lipavsky says the European Union should introduce more sanctions against Russia's technology sector to curb Moscow's ability to produce arms and rockets it is using to wage war on Ukraine. He spoke after EU member states' foreign ministers have agreed to allocate another 500 million euros in military aid for Ukraine and discussed more sanctions against Russia and how to hold the Kremlin accountable for starting the war 11 months ago.
I think we have two debates. First debate is to be looking for new ways how to limit Russia's ability to wage war. I'm speaking about looking for ways how to decrease the ability to produce weapons, rockets used for shelling Ukraine's critical infrastructure. To end the conflict, we need to arm Ukraine so the Ukraine is able to defend itself and Russia is not able to push through with its agenda of imperialism and stealing territory. And of course, I would very much welcome if Germany approves the at least licenses or would put all own tanks for export to Ukraine. So definitely this cannot be considered as an escalation, and Ukraine has a full right to protect its independence, its territorial integrity and sovereignty.
Let's talk now to Professor Denis Soltis of the Department of Public Administration and International Development at the Kimep University in Almaty, Kazakhstan. Good morning to you, Denis, and welcome to the program.
Oh, hello, nice to see you. You hear me?
Yes, very loud and clear. There's been a lot of dramatic developments. I know that today we're supposed to discuss some history, but just before we get into that, I can't help but ask you about your view about some of this dramatic developments. Overnight, Germany has agreed to send those Leopard tanks itself, and it has also said it will not prevent other countries from doing so. On the other hand, it would seem that is because, as we're hearing, the United States has also agreed to send Ukraine the M1 Abrams tanks, which Germany had indicated that it wanted as part of a package to be sent to Ukraine, and not only the tanks. What do you make of this?
Well, first of all, the big news is the Ramstein meeting itself, where, well, different, interesting what's happening. We've talked about this before. I think this indicates that, first of all, the collective West has lost some of its fear of a Ukrainian victory, which might precipitate a Russian nuclear response. The other thing is that the aid package is indeed large this time. So it seems to indicate, an irreversible Western commitment now to help Ukraine militarily. I'll talk about the tanks in a moment. So, but I think there are three things, somewhat, well, not necessarily unrelated or somewhere related, that's happening here. As I've just said, the West seems to be losing its fear of a Ukrainian victory. That's one possible interpretation. Another is that they might sense an opportunity for Ukraine in the south militarily. There are reasons to believe that the Ukrainian army could break through and cut the Russian land bridge to Crimea, and this would be a major, not only military, but political development. And the other thing is somewhat the other way, is that there is now a great fear of a Russian victory. If Russia wins and starts, rolling over Ukraine, it would be, quite, well, proud and arrogant, and wouldn't necessarily invade Poland or the Baltics, but they could start, as the Russians would, Moscow would, staging all kinds of provocations. So this does start to become a NATO issue, and it's Russia that is threatening to make the confrontation wider. And in one view, that the Europeans have become very frightened by this, and this is why they've now decided, to open up the warehouses and send more weapons. As far as the tanks, the Abrams versus the Leopard, well, you've already said it. The Germans didn't want to appear to be escalating. They didn't want to appear to be the first to be escalating. So they said, well, but we will be part of a coalition if there is another coalition. And of course, Poland and some other countries have offered to start a coalition. And now the Americans are, they're working out a deal. They're working on it. I think the Leopards will arrive. Yeah. So the Americans and Germans have reached are reaching an agreement on the provision of these Abrams tanks, which really aren't the best possible tanks for the conditions there. These tanks are very complex to operate. I think they're delicate. They break down easily. They're not really the best. America would send, I think, 30 tanks, kind of just for symbolic reasons, just in order to overcome the German reluctance. But anyway, there is movement on that tank issue. Well, you're probably aware, Poland threatens to send tanks and Leopards even without permission, and they maybe would invoke force majeure. They said, we can't just sit by while our neighboring country is being bled to death, and we might be next. So the Poles were at least rhetorically prepared to send tanks without German permission, and there might even be a provision in the original contract for force majeure. I don't know. Okay, but that's somewhat of what I know about this issue.
Now, let me quickly ask you, on the other side, I mean, the Russians are not going to sit back and take all of this. You referenced the fact that it seems as if the West may have lost its fear of the saber-rattling over the use of nuclear weapons. But they may have lost the fear, but the reality is that nobody really knows whether or not the Russians can, in fact, do this. If I take your mind back, a couple of weeks ago, just as last year was ending, the Russians sent a carrier out of Russia into the Gulf area, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, and that carrier had hypersonic missiles on it. Who knows what else was on it? And the Russians are also ramping up production of weapons at home. And only a couple of days ago, Dmitry Medvedev, the deputy chairman of the Russian military council, did remind the world that they would use nuclear weapons if it became clear that because of the array they might be facing in Ukraine, they could possibly be defeated. So this isn't going away.
Okay, well, I think it's a little bit of a misconception that that Russia says, Moscow says, Ukraine should buckle down or else we'll do something terrible. Well, they've already tried everything terrible. If they could, they would. So Russia is not holding anything back here. That's kind of a red herring. As far as the nuclear issue, that's certainly legitimate. But what has Russia tried? The gas weapon, blackmailing Europe. Then it failed to beat the Ukrainian army on the battlefield. Then they started targeting Ukrainian civilians, and then the infrastructure. But they still have at least one more strategy left before this issue of nuclear weapons comes up, and that is the mobilization of both soldiers and industry. So that's going to take, well, by various accounts, 3, 6, 12 months. So I think they'll go that route. They'll try to see how the mobilization goes. And for Putin in that mindset, this is not tragic, sending tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of soldiers to their deaths. It's just an option. So I think that's where we would stand. So the Russians still have that strategy in reserve to see how the mobilization of men and industry goes before other options might be considered. But then notice here also that this doesn't happen all at once. There's a dynamic happening, and if indeed it happened that the Russians suffer setbacks on the southern front or elsewhere, well, then this will start demoralizing the population, the people in the army. Putin's own political status would decline. So it's possible that this nuclear issue could be finessed somehow. This is the rationale behind the Biden administration's strategy of gradualism. That metaphor of the frog in the water, the frog in the hot water. So this is what they've been doing. Yeah, raising, the temperature gradually, so that there isn't any definite tipping point or panic point at which Moscow might want to hit the nuclear button. So now, of course, the nuclear threat is good. I mean, Moscow is incentivized to use this threat because it's effective. As long as they keep threatening and the threat is taken seriously, then of course they keep repeating the threat. It's just simple logic.
Let's come to the historical basis for this, because a lot of people do not understand most of the dynamics or the mechanics of what is going on. For example, why Germany was reluctant to go it alone against Russia. So many people among those who know point back to World War II and what happened in its immediate aftermath to explain partly why the Germans were so reluctant. But I want to talk about where you are, Kazakhstan, and the countries in that area. For many of us on this side of the world, those places are, shall we say, relatively unknown in terms of what happens there and the dynamics. Now, I want to ask you, to give us a brief background of how this works. I know that Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, Turkmenistan, and a couple of others in the region were all very, very, very close to the then Soviet Union. But when the Soviet Union broke up, many of these countries tried to find their way because in the chaos that ensued, they were more or less left to themselves. Now, the war in Ukraine has highlighted some of the political differences as well as the economic ties that exist. Now, give us an idea of all that, how all that is playing out right now, given where we are with the war in Ukraine.
Well, I've said this before. These countries are sort of, being more cautious. They're kind of drifting gradually away from Russia. Kazakhstan has never recognized the annexations and war or Russia's occupation in Ukraine. Kazakhstan, doesn't follow or does follow the sanctions. It does not allow Russia to bypass the economic sanctions. It has sent, a little bit of humanitarian aid, so that's kind of a principled position to Ukraine. Now, the other thing, I'll digress here to a different issue. Kazakhstan also is accepting refugees from Ukraine, and especially from Crimea. Crimea has, the Crimean Tatars. They're Muslim and they're Turkic people that is related sort of to Kazakhs. And the situation of the Crimean Tatars is very dire. Still, when Crimea was annexed in 2014, life for the Tatars became very unbearable, and about 45,000 out of 300,000 or so left at that time when it was possible. And now they continue to leave because now they are being forced, the Tatars, who are easy to identify and are very strongly identify with Ukraine or support Ukraine, are being targeted. They've always been very targeted by the Crimean authorities, by the Crimean occupation regime. So they are being forced, recruited and forced to fight against Ukraine. This is, of course, breaks all kinds of, Geneva Conventions here. And 2,000 or so about of them have managed to get to Kazakhstan. So Kazakhstan is offering refuge to the Crimean Tatars. So that says something, I think, about Kazakhstan's position here.
But how about the others? What can you tell us about the others? That is a very big region there with a large geographical landmass and significant population.
Well, Uzbekistan, for instance, has long followed a policy of Uzbekistanization of schools, of the whole information system. Russia, the Putin government, have never objected to the so-called abuse of Russian rights in Uzbekistan, as long as you had an obedient or predictable authoritarian government there. Some of the and the other countries are following suit. I've pointed out, the other 4 countries are south of Kazakhstan, so they don't actually share a Russian border. So Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan, culturally, their cultural orientation is definitely, away from Russia. Geopolitically, more ambiguous, but Turkmenistan has, even before the war, been sending lots of, gas and trade with China. And also the Turkic world. Turkey is also, a significant player in the region. We mentioned last time also France had made some overtures, and of course China has a presence there. So all of these countries are diversifying their relations. But the war itself, I think, is kind of distant from them. I don't think it really forces them very much one way or another to, I don't think there's really that much concern for panic at the moment.
Where do you see?
And that is or concern for some kind of major, Russian action or offensive or aggression, because Russia is got its hands full with Ukraine right now.
Where do you see this going? Where do you see this going? Now the West, as you said, seems to have decided to be all in. The Russians had indicated before that what they expect in this year, 2023, and it seems to have come early, is that they expect that they will soon be facing the NATO alliance itself, either directly or by proxy. At the very moment, it does look as if they will be facing them by proxy, at least for now, in that they will just be sending in weapons, tanks, possibly at some stage aircraft into Ukraine. But this, indeed, whether or not it's said, does escalate the conflict and draws in others who up until now had, remained apart, so to say.
Well, okay. Well, I'm not a military expert, and of course, I don't have first-hand information from the field. So all I can do is, quote what other authoritative people, American generals and officials, and Ukrainian ones and other ones have said. My dilemma here is they all say different things, so I can't really, I just very many different ideas about what is actually happening. So, I couldn't really say with much confidence what is happening. So that is all very ambiguous. The main imponderables, I think, will be actually, now that the West is all in, the main imponderable is from the Russian side. How successful will be the recruitment of soldiers, the mobilization of industry, and how their economy will hold up under sanctions. So that, everything is just, very uncertain. Warfare is always uncertain. I think that the military situation is manageable, and if I'm going by what these military experts say, it seems that Ukraine does have a pretty good chance of breaking the land corridor to Crimea, and then that, as I said, would set in train various kind of political dynamics. So that to me seems the most likely in the short run, although it'll be costly because the Russians have already succeeded in greatly strengthening that sector. Their mobilization is ongoing. So by all accounts, there will be a major confrontation and a major bloodbath or series of bloodbaths sometimes in the spring. But how this will go, well, I don't know. I can just, as I've done here, enunciate the options, the possibilities.
Indeed, indeed. Professor Soltis, thank you so much for this analysis. Grim prediction there about the bloodbaths, but I guess we'll have to wait and see how it comes out. Professor Soltis, thank you for your time, all from Almaty in Kazakhstan. Thank you.
Take care of yourself. Nice seeing you again.
Thank you. Now, even though South Africa declares a non-aligned stance in the Russia-Ukraine conflict, she reserves the right to make her own decisions. And that's the position of its Minister for International Relations and Cooperation, Dr. Naledi Pandor. Dr. Pandor was speaking to reporters at a news conference where she said she has the good of South Africans at heart when she makes those comments.
Between the two countries, a number of bilateral cooperation.
The Intergovernmental Committee on Trade and Economic Cooperation remains an active platform for coordinating our bilateral relations, and that ITEC continues to meet regularly and has made considerable progress in deepening the cooperation between South Africa and the Russian Federation. I reiterate the view of South Africa that multilateralism and dialogues are key to unlocking international peace. I reiterate that view because that is the South African position. We have continued and will continue to urge that there should be a diplomatic solution and process to this current conflict because we regard war as terrible. We regard war as a negative for development and for world security.
I would like to highly appreciate the position of principle of South Africa, including the position which you, Madam Minister, introduced in your recent interview. I respect the openness and the responsible approach which you demonstrated on the basis of your allegiance to the key national interest of South Africa and its people.
U.S. and Western officials are urging Ukraine to shift its focus from the brutal months-long fight in the eastern city of Bakhmut and prioritize a potential offensive in the south instead, using a different style of fighting that takes advantage of the billions of dollars in new military hardware recently committed by Western allies. For nearly 6 months, Ukrainian forces have been going toe-to-toe with the Russians over roughly 36 miles of territory in Bakhmut, which lies between the separatist-held cities of Donetsk and Luhansk. Heavy shelling has left the city almost completely destroyed. Now, ahead of what is widely expected to be a brutal spring of fighting, there is a tactical opening, and U.S. and Western officials say that in recent weeks they have begun suggesting that Ukrainian forces cut their losses in Bakhmut, which they argue has lethal strategic significance for Ukraine, and focus instead on planning for an offensive in the south. And Bulgaria's defense ministry says the country's navy has defused a naval mine that had drifted close to its Black Sea coast a day after it carried out a controlled explosion of another mine. The ministry said the Navy was alerted to the object that was some 14.8 nautical miles east of the coast near Cape Cochin by a motorboat sailing under a Ukrainian flag. Romania, Bulgaria, and Turkey, all of which have coasts along the Black Sea, have had special diving teams defuse mines that drifted into their waters. Thanks for staying tuned. Welcome back. Here's Ini John McQuarrie of our business desk. Morning, Ini.
Morning. Good morning.
Can Europe escape recession?
Well, it's looking more positive now. Remember, I think about a month now, IMF had come out to say that there's a possibility with the reopening of economies and economic activities in China,
right,
that there's a possibility that the global recession that everybody was scared of may escape, or the world may escape it. So now what has happened, I don't know if to call this divine, you know, in Nigeria we're very religious.
We're very quick to call on, yes.
Exactly. So we've been talking about how gas prices have dropped more than 50% in the last couple of weeks, you know, because of the weather. So the weather is not as bad, as cold as it was expected to be. And we remember that Europe had been very aggressive in filling their tanks. They have new terminals to receive. They had new relationship that they have started to receive gas, you know, just to prepare them. So with all of that supply and the weather not being as bad as it was expected to be, we see gas prices dropping. So what that means is that energy cost is dropping and should feed into inflation. And then with the positive news coming from China, right, you know, IMF and Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan are saying there's a possibility that the Eurozone may escape recession, even though their growth is going to be very small, exactly,
anemic.
Yes, but you know, recession is 2 negative quarters of growth. So if they escape that, if they don't have those 2 negative quarters, then
statistically
yes,
we're not in recession.
Exactly. That's some good news in all of this.
Yeah, but while that seems to be some good news, the hedge funds
yes,
are not really having good news.
No. Maybe to be better, because this is a report from last year, and we did see that the hedge fund lost about over 100 billion.
Yes, 125 billion dollars. Yes.
So the hedge fund is, you know, investment. So for instance, an individual does not really want to go out there and buy maybe the stocks or shares of a company or fixed income. So you put your money in a company that manages it for you. So what they do is they spread your money. So that's where you're supposed to be able to hedge against, okay, if the equities market is down, at least the fixed income should be okay, or gold should be okay, you know, and things like that. So last year it was seen that the hedge hedge fund dropped by $125 billion. Meanwhile, the year before, we had seen it increase by $15 billion. So that's to say that a lot of people were not thinking of investment or saving last year. They were thinking more of just surviving, you know, and perhaps that's why there was that leakage from the hedge fund industry.
Now, there's report that traders are sneaking in banned Russian and Belarusian wood into the EU. Why?
Because it's on the list, on the sanction list, you know, so obviously it's not supposed to be traded. Remember that. I think the areas where the sanction is ignoring is the area of food,
medicines,
yes, fertilizers, some of those very necessary ones. So wood is on the sanction list. But unfortunately, what has happened is after the sanction, Europe has seen, I mean, last year they had the inflow of wood was about 445,000 euros.
Right.
That is what they had for last year, for 2 years ago. But last year, between June and October, believe it or not, they had to spend about 30 million euros on wood. So suddenly, because of the sanction, the cost or the prices of wood went up. So that means that maybe the money that could have bought 5 wood before will buy one or thereabout. But what has also happened is that Europe was now flooded with wood. And they said it was from Kazakhstan. And Kazakhstan doesn't have that much of forest. So some Belarusian investigators went underground and saw that there were some games going on with paperwork. So the wood is actually coming from Russia and Belarus, but is being papered as if it's coming from Asian countries and heading back to the same Europe that
ostensibly put them on sanctions. Well, I mean, look.
Ways of survival, I think.
I think that is the way it is. Thank you, Ini. Ini, of course, will have details of other stories right after this on Business Morning and later on Beijing. Thanks.
Thank you for having me.
Now, an expert on existential threats says the doomsday clock created by the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists as an indicator of the world's susceptibility to the apocalypse should be taken closer to midnight this year. Paul Ingram, Senior Research Associate at the Center for the Study of Existential Risk at the University of Cambridge, says the threat of nuclear war and climate change were among factors likely to push the arms of the symbolic clock closer to doom. Mr. Ingram, who is not among the scientists to decide the position of the clock, said if nuclear war were to break out, billions of people would die due to the follow-on effects on the climate that could cause mass starvation and other disasters.
The doomsday clock has been around for a number of decades. It emerged at the beginning of the Cold War to give a sense of the urgency to achieve nuclear disarmament and to climb out of the abyss that we were facing in the early 1950s. And in more recent times, it has taken on climate change and emerging disruptive technology to give a sense of the risks, the catastrophic risks that we face as a planet, largely through our own deliberate activities. If I were in charge of it, yes, I would be taking it closer. We've seen the emergence of a new war, invasion of Ukraine, the warnings of nuclear weapons use. We've seen the failure of COP27 to come up with any serious attempts to curb the activities of the fossil fuel industry. And we've seen the emergence of new artificial intelligence capabilities, which we still haven't really grasped. If we start to see the exchange of nuclear weapons, it's likely that we will see a nuclear war, which is extremely, extremely worrying, not least because the second threat then comes into being, which is that it's not just a risk of the detonations, the blasts, the radiation, which everybody is aware of, but it's the global climatic effects that are likely to kill the most people from a nuclear war, probably in the billions.
And then moving on to the sport, the Russian Football Union has held its first talks with UEFA aimed at ending its exclusion from European football. However, its hopes of a return are reportedly unlikely due to the war in Ukraine, and it is set to be stripped of another major match. Russia's national governing body has considered transferring its affiliation to the Asian Football Confederation, but that proposal was shelved, and it instead sought the creation of a working group to discuss a return to UEFA competitions. It's been reported that an initial meeting between the RFU and UEFA officials has taken place, with further talks planned for next month. And finally, on the program, the Best Documentary Prize at the Oscars this year will be going to films about topics ranging from the opioid crisis in the U.S. to the impact of pollution. Golden Lion winning All the Beauty and the Bloodshed follows the story of photographer Nan Golden's life and her bid to hold the Sackler family to account for the U.S. opioid crisis. Meanwhile, All That Breathes is about two Muslim brothers living in Delhi who are devoted to saving the black kite, a bird which often falls from the sky due to pollution levels. The Glory of Volcanoes is at the heart of Fire of Love, which is made of archive footage of partners Katia and Maurice Kraft, who both died exploring the volcanoes they loved. Russian opposition leader Alexei Navalny is the focus of a film which follows his life after he was poisoned in 2020 and the impact of his decision to return home. Viewers are taken to a children's home near the front line in Ukraine in a house made of splinters, a film about the care workers and children in the busy facility. Winners of the industry's highest honors will be unveiled at a ceremony on March the 12th, hosted by comedian Jimmy Kimmel and aired live on Netflix.
जो चीजें सांस लेती हैं उनमें कोई फर्क नहीं दिखना चाहिए.
All right, something to look forward to there within all the green predictions. Thanks for being with us. My name is Ladi Akari Duluale. Do have yourselves a pleasant day out there. Morning.